Looks like we're live.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you from wherever you're joining us. We're happy to hear that you're here today with us at GCP Online Meetup number 51. I'm Anthony Bushong, Solutions Engineer at Google Cloud, joined with my co-host, Mark
Mirchandani. I can introduce myself, but thank you. I appreciate it. Customer engineer here at Google.
And so we are joined by our intrepid host that you've typically that you've seen across several other meetups, but today he's our presenter. So Yuri, you want to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure, folks. My name is Yuri Grinshteyn. I'm also a customer engineer here at Google. And today I'm here to talk to you about Stackdriver.
Awesome. Well, let's just dive right into it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. So what we're gonna, this may be somewhat of a brief session, but kind of looking through our content so far, I realized that some things we really haven't touched on are one, generally topics around monitoring, right? So what I'm going to basically cover is kind of like why monitoring is important, which I think we've covered before when we did the kind of the Stackdriver overview. This was now some number of months ago. But the thing that I want to focus on today is kind of differentiating the things that Stackdriver does for you out of the box, which are all kind of metrics that are in the platform, metrics that it can collect about your infrastructure, metrics that you can collect using a Stackdriver monitoring agent, obviously logging metrics. But what I'm focus on today is how to write your own custom metrics, right? There could be any number of reasons why you might want to do that. Let's say you want to track something specific that your application is doing, or you want to add some additional instrumentation to your application, and there's you haven't really figured out how to do that yet. So that's why we're here today. All right, so Stackdriver provides an easy API that you can use to send data directly to the platform, and then that data shows up, and you can actually basically do your own instrumentation and your own monitoring.
Now, I know we covered the basics of Stackdriver, but just to kind of give a quick overview of it, you gave an example of creating custom metrics. What might be an out-of-the-box metric, and what might be a good example of a custom one?
Yeah, great question. So the out-of-the-box metrics that Stackdriver collects are listed here, right? So there are platform metrics, which is to mean if you have things that you are running using GCP managed services, right? Let's say you are using App Engine as your front end, maybe you've got a data flow pipeline, you're storing data in BigQuery, right? All those things are GCP managed services, and they're all natively instrumented within Stackdriver, right? So you go to Stackdriver, you look for metrics, there are metrics about all those different services that are there for you without you having to do anything, right? That's one of the benefits of using managed services. Then if you're using infrastructure, right, if you're using, let's say, Compute Engine or even AWS EC2, and you want to monitor those things, then we collect, or when I say we, Stackdriver collects metrics about that infrastructure, right? So you can get things like how much CPU is my machine using, how much network throughput is it generating, how much disk, how much free space do I have on my disk. If you then install an Stackdriver agent on that machine, you get some additional metrics. So you're starting to get things like how much memory is available versus used on the machine, what are like the top processes that are running, and how much resources they're using, right? And then from there, obviously Stackdriver is also collecting logs, and you can also create metrics out of logs. So you can say like, this message is an error message that I write to my logs. I want to know how many times that message appears. So those are all the things that Stackdriver will do for you basically out of the box without you having to do anything, right? So your question, like, okay, with all of that given to me, why would I ever want to write my own?
It sounds pretty comprehensive. So
yeah, exactly. Great question. So imagine that, and I'm just going to talk about this example because Google, the Game Developer Conference is happening this week. So all things gaming are on my mind right now. So imagine that you are a company who's publishing a game on GCP. You're using GCP as your backend. Maybe you're using the brand new, Kubernetes gaming server, and you want to know some things. You want to collect telemetry about the game itself, right? So you want to collect things. How many active players do I have? How many of them are performing a specific action at any one time, right? How many of them are looking at my in-app store, for example, versus how many of them are not? If it's a real-time game, actually want to track like the specific events that people are participating in or interacting with. Like Stackdriver doesn't do that for you, right? So you can write your own instrumentation, and you can use something like Prometheus or Grafana as the back end and collect all that information. But then you have a bunch of stuff that's in Stackdriver, and then a bunch of stuff that's in Prometheus, for example. Right? Whereas you can simply use a Stackdriver Monitoring API, just send all that data to the API, and the Stackdriver is basically your single source of truth for any and all things metric. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
You do bring up a good point that I'm interested in hearing more about. So I think that part of Stackdriver, so you brought up the example of Prometheus and Grafana.
Yeah.
Right. So with Grafana, we get visualizations and things like that. My understanding is that Stackdriver acts as a backend for these kind of time series data, but will also provide you the ability to create charts and graphs on top of this information and then alerting. Is that something that is extended to custom metrics as well? Because I'd imagine I'd want to see kind of when certain threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. So once a metric is in Stackdriver, it really doesn't matter how it gets there.
Okay.
Right. So the same things around the thresholding, alerting, reporting, dashboarding apply no matter whether that's a platform metric, an infrastructure metric, a logging metric, or a custom metric.
That's awesome.
Right. And that's another reason why you might want to use Stackdriver as your backend for these things.
Sure.
Is because you're getting all of the features of Stackdriver, you get them no matter where your data comes from.
Awesome.
All right. So yeah.
You have a demo for us?
I do. Well, I do have a demo. Let's hope it works as always. The code that I'm using to kind of do this very basic example is available on GitHub. You can see the link here. Take a look, and please do not judge my code too harshly. So we've already talked a little bit about this, but I did want to kind of bring a little data to this conversation. Who cares? Who cares about metrics? Who cares about custom metrics specifically? Well, if you go on Stack Overflow right now and you search for Stackdriver metrics, there's something like 177 results. This was like a couple days ago. Maybe there's more now, but 177 results for Stackdriver metrics. Just about a third of those are for Stackdriver custom metrics, right? So this is clearly something that people are, at least on Stack Overflow, are trying to do. So it seems like a question lots of people have. When I started kind of getting ready for this session and kind of building out the demo, I had to do a little bit of digging in the documentation. The docs are all there, but I didn't really see anyone that said hey, here's how you do the very basic thing of take a number, write it to Stackdriver.
Yeah, which is interesting because based on the point you brought up earlier, I mean, this is obviously something that a lot of people care about.
Yeah.
And clearly, the baseline of Stackdriver gives you out of the box stuff, but you really will need to customize it based on what your workload is or what kind of application you're trying to build. So clearly this is a big deal.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully we got some people tuning in, watching this. Hopefully they think that this is a good use of their time. It's been, it was a fun exercise learning all this and kind of getting through the nitty gritty of the API.
Yeah, and if you're going to go through the demo later, hopefully everyone who's watching, feel free to ask questions so we can, kind of respond to those in real time, or maybe we'll save time afterwards. But, if you have questions, we'd love to kind of help understand what those are and talk about them and maybe dig up some answers as well.
Yeah.
Or just say hi. We like to know that you're there.
Yeah, that's good too.
There are 28 people watching, so.
No way. All right, cool. That's awesome. All right, so let's get into it, right? So how do you actually use the API to write metrics to the Stackdriver backend? 5 easy steps, right? I wish there were 3. I was like the number 3, but they're basically 5, and I'll go through them in my actual. I'll show you the code that does all of them. So first, whatever language you're working in, you have to include the monitoring library that kind of creates the client for you. But the things you actually need to do is you'll create the descriptor for the metric. You'll create the actual data point, and these are all objects, right? So you create an object that is like the descriptor of your metric. You create a data point, which is what is the actual value and timestamp of that value that I can write, right? And the obvious example is I'm going to write the current value of a given metric right now, right? But there are things you can do with API that actually allow you to write metrics actually slightly into the future and obviously into the past. So if there's instrumentation in your application that you're sort of capturing, and then you want to kind of retroactively write it to the API, you can actually put a timestamp that's not right now. You can say I know that I observed a value yesterday, and I want to send it to the API, and then the data gets written to the Stackdriver backend, and it'll be available for reporting. So if you're writing some kind of an, let's say, aggregation or something like that in your application in instrumentation, you can have an aggregated metric. If you don't want to use Stackdriver aggregation, that might be one example why you might want to use in the past timestamp. All right. So you get your descriptor, you got your actual data point, which is your value and your timestamp. Then you actually create the time series in your descriptor. So this gets a little complicated, and quite honestly, I got a little lost at this point. But basically, the idea is that a single metric can actually have multiple time series in it. So an example of that might be that I have, and I'll take a very basic example, is let's say you have your metric is CPU, right? But that CPU can be measured across lots and lots of different machines, right? So it's a single metric, lots of time series, right? So the API also enables you to do that. Right? So in my example, it's literally one metric descriptor, one data point, one time series, pretty straightforward, right? So you create those three objects, and then you basically issue the write command, and it sends it to Stackdriver.
And based on what you were just mentioning, like it sounds like you could actually use these metrics across multiple different multiple different metrics, all kinds of things, and still be able to use kind of the same general workflow.
Absolutely.
So you're just adding a lot of complexity into what actually gets written down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, this can be as complex as you want it to be. Let's take a look at my code, such as it is, in case you are still with us but still confused. Let's actually show you exactly what this looks like. So what I've done is I've basically written two things, right? I have a basic writer app that's running. I wrote it in Node because that's really the only language I have any comfort with. I try to kind of duplicate it in things like Go and Python, and I'm just not good at those.
Okay.
I deployed on an app engine just because it was the simplest way, so I didn't like stand up a Kubernetes cluster or anything like that. Although the code that I'm using can literally run anywhere. You can actually run it locally, and it will still write to the API if you have the right credentials. So that's actually another reason why you might want to use custom metrics. This is actually a way to get data from your even on-premise environment into Stackdriver.
Right.
So like we don't have support for on-premise infrastructure, for example. So if you were to install the agent or something like that, we don't have a way to know that your a VM is running on-premise. We just don't have that entity in Stackdriver. But you could still use this mechanism to get information from your on-premise environment into Stackdriver.
So it's a great way of, no matter where your application kind of starts, or maybe if it ends up in a different infrastructure, anything like that, as long as you kind of have the same API, you're able to move it around and continue using it without an issue.
Exactly.
Perfect.
All right. So that's all it is, right? I got a basic Node app running on App Engine, and just calling the monitoring API to write time series data. All right. So let me show you the code first. I'll switch to my code view. So there are basically two pieces here, right? I've got a very basic, I'll make it actually a little bigger just so that you can see it maybe on the video. You've got a sort of a very basic HTML page that's literally just an HTML form. I mean, it is as basic can be, right? Just doing a basic post. And I just added this message that says, hey, you actually sent it off, right? That's all it is. It's just posting back to the same, posting to basically the root, right? And then I've got my node, single file node app using Express, right? So I'll walk you through kind of what this actually does. But basically, you're just instantiating your Express app. You're instantiating the parser that will allow you to process your form data. And here is you can see the monitoring and the client. These are where you are including your monitoring library and then actually creating an instance of it, right? The other thing you need here is to specify the project you're running. So from here, just like I said, right, step one is you create your request object. So here's the code that does that, right? Pretty straightforward, right? This is your, not your request object, this is your metric descriptor, right? So you're putting in what is the description of the metric, what is the display name, which is like the name that you actually see in Stackdriver, the type. And the interesting thing about the type is the key thing that you actually need to understand is this, how this API is constructed. So I'm actually writing this against the global resource. So Stackdriver really has two kinds of resources that it understands. There's this like global resource, which basically means it's not a thing that Stackdriver considers an entity, right? And then everything else is written against a resource. So there could be like a VM resource, or let's say a data flow pipeline resource, or a pub sub topic resource, right? All of those entities that live in GCP, those are all resources. And you can actually write metrics against them. Right? So as long as you identify the right resource, you can actually, from what I understand, you can actually use this API to write custom metrics against those resources. So you can basically extend the monitoring that Stackdriver does out of the box by using the monitoring API.
So you kind of have two options. You can use the global one for just kind of generics.
Yeah.
And then if you want to get a little bit more specific about what kind of infrastructure it's set up on or how it's running, you can actually extend those individual types.
Yeah, exactly. Cool. All right. So now we've got our descriptor. We created, right? I'll put a bunch of stuff to the log. And then we're basically just into the request handling features of Express, right? So here, basically, if someone just, I don't know if you're not familiar with Express, you're basically doing routing here. So the first thing you're doing, basically, if someone does a get to the home page, they get redirected to my HTML file. And then when that file does a post, here's what happens, right? So first thing I'm doing is I'm basically pulling out the value that they submitted, right? Pretty straightforward. I'm writing into the log. Then I'm actually creating my data point. Okay. Pretty straightforward. I basically need two things, right? One is basically my timestamp, right? Which is my internal object. And the second thing is the value. And here I'm just setting it to 0, and then just down here I'm using it separate. You could actually do this in the same place, but I'm just doing it separately, basically setting the value to the value of my metric, right? So what I've done so far is I've created my metric descriptor, and I've created my data point, right? So far, so good?
Yeah.
All right. Next, I'm actually going to instantiate my time series, right, within my metric. So here you go again. I'm identifying the global resource, right, in the project that I've identified ahead of time. My project ID is a variable that I set at the start. Okay. So I know the project that I'm writing to. I know the resource type that I'm writing this metric to. And I know the value I'm writing to, which is my data point. Okay. And then I'm actually going to go ahead and write it, right? So it's my write request. And then I call the create time series method to actually send it. And then once it's sent, I just redirect it right back to the same page.
Okay, so the whole workflow is relatively straightforward. You have this form that submits when a post comes in. You actually write all this data, send it over to Stackdriver, and send them back.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's just the infrastructure around the demo.
Yep.
Easy enough.
Pretty straightforward. So now let's take a look at it running. I've got it running on App Engine, so I should probably make this somehow, secure this somehow, because as of right now, I think it's just open to the world, so best of luck to me.
You've got about 10 minutes, everybody,
Yeah.
to do what you can here, and then we'll shut that URL down.
Yeah,
So have fun.
I have done, as you saw from my code, I've done zero filtering or validation on the form data.
Well,
So I have absolutely no idea what would happen if people started writing, alphanumeric or.
keep it clean, people,
Yeah,
please.
that's right.
You could turn this into an App Engine scaling demo.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, yeah, we're about to find out.
I mean, we only have like a handful of people. Well, but 29 people to see how much load they can all generate. So pretty straightforward. Right? I send the value. I say let's send the value 8. I say submit. It tells me that hey, it's sent 8,
Right.
and then it just shows the page again. Right? Nothing terribly interesting in the page itself. So now let's go to my Stackdriver dashboard. Right. So I've actually created a dashboard in Stackdriver that basically just has a chart for this single metric. So you can see I was doing testing earlier this morning. There's the value 10. You can see the number entered is, remember in my code, that was the value that I specified as the display name for the metric. So there it is. And if I mouse over it, you can see the numeric underscore metric is the metric name, again, as specified in my code.
Sure.
So now the delay on this has been a few seconds, but I'm actually going to refresh the page and see if that value shows up, and there it is.
Perfect.
Cool. There's the number 8. Okay. So I imagine you can do this at scale. You can have any number of custom metrics that are going against lots of different resources.
Sure.
But that's basically how you go about using the Stackdriver Monitoring API to write data. So that's some of the questions you asked. Like, can I do alerting on it, right? So reporting, dashboarding, right? There it is. Yeah. I can also go to where's my metric explorer, right? And there I can start just writing custom, without the caps lock being on, and there is my metric, right? Okay. So when I start typing custom, any metric that starts with custom will show up, and so now I can, this metric is available in Metric Explorer. You can see there's my, my 8 data point that I just wrote. If I wanted to do something like alerting, on that metric, right? Let's create a policy. I can add a condition. I can say this, let's just do a basic threshold metric, right? Select that, resource type, right? Custom metrics. And there's my custom metric called number entered. So now I can specify thresholds for it. Right?
So would you say if I want to get real crazy with custom metrics, it might be better to tie them to resources? Because at this global level, it seems great for something that can kind of trying to just get it off the ground. But over time, distribute across multiple different resources I might be using, I might want to start tying those to resources, right?
Yeah, I think it really depends on what does the metric actually represent. Okay, right. So like, obviously in our example, this is like a totally abstract thing. It doesn't represent anything. It's literally just a number over time.
Right.
Sure.
But when you're writing your own instrumentation, like you're doing it for a reason, right? Because you want to understand, excuse me, some specific behavior of your application.
Right.
So if you're trying to better understand the behavior of some component of your infrastructure, then yeah, you want to tie that metric to that component, right? But if this is a metric that describes the behavior of your application, then you may want to perhaps define a specific resource for that, or maybe it's totally fine to have it be just a global custom metric, because what you can actually do is use kind of slash path separators to give yourself a little more visibility and separation between all your different global resources, right? So your resources can be like, global / my app / authorization, right?
So you can like pseudo names.
Exactly, exactly. You can group your metrics kind of, even without tying them to specific objects.
Very nice.
And going back to your example before, kind of like a game engine, or hosting this application that you're measuring a lot of things that aren't necessarily tied to the individual resources. It would make a lot of sense then to use these global ones, kind of create your pseudo namespaces and measure out all these different things that may not be tied to your actual resources.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
We do have a question in the chat from Vijay. So I think this might be an easy one for you, Yuri.
Let's hope.
He is asking, can we monitor and customize AWS Cloud 2 with Stackdriver?
Yeah, so Stackdriver has out-of-the-box support specifically for EC2 instances. You can, there's actually a Stackdriver quick start for EC2 in the documentation. There's a few steps involved. You basically have to create a role in AWS to give Stackdriver access to those resources, and then basically use that role within Stackdriver to get information about those EC2 instances. You can then additionally install the Stackdriver monitoring and logging agents on those instances to get additional information. So yeah, short answer, absolutely. Slightly longer answer is take a look at the Stackdriver quick start for AWS, which is I think an easy way to understand how that works. And then things like this, things like custom metrics is obviously a way to do whatever instrumentation you want to do in that environment and just send all that data over if it's not being collected out of the box.
But you could do that if it's on-prem, if it's
anyway.
on Google, AWS. You can do it on all three of them, actually.
When I was actually testing this, I was running this application just locally, like literally on my laptop. I would just run Node server.js, and then it would come up, and I would kind of do submit. And because I was authenticated to GCP through the gcloud auth command, even though it had local credentials, so I was able to post to that API having the credentials. So maybe the question that people might have that haven't asked yet is the authentication, right? So as you can see, because this web page is open, there's no authentication. You don't have to authenticate to the web page to do it, right? The authentication is happening server side, right? So it's authenticating to the monitoring API, typically using a server account, a service account. Obviously, if you're running an app engine, we do that for you. You don't have to worry about authentication, but all the authentication is done server side.
And so if you're running this application not on App Engine and you need to kind of create that service account and handle it, of course, the best practice would typically be to create a service account that only has access to Stackdriver.
Absolutely, yeah. Scope it to the monitoring API, and then just send all the information through that service account.
Okay. We have a couple more questions.
Great.
Elvis Slim wants to know if the data can be scraped by Prometheus.
So absolutely, you can. Well, let me make sure I answer this question without making stuff up. We do not today have out-of-the-box integration between Stackdriver and Prometheus, right? So if you're sending data to the monitoring API, it is explicitly going to Stackdriver as the backend. That is how things stand today. You may have heard about OpenCensus, which is like literally just went to like basically the initial release. I'm not even sure if we would call it alpha or beta or whatever the state of it is. But it's basically, we've open sourced a tracing and instrumentation library that we've been using internally as Census, and now it's called OpenCensus. So that can actually be configured to use just about anything as a backend, including Prometheus. So maybe the short answer to Elvis's question is, if you have a need to add instrumentation in your application and you want to use Prometheus as a backend, please take a look at OpenCensus. And sneak preview, I'm going to be having a conversation about OpenCensus on this very stage with one of the developers of OpenCensus in mid-May, when the APIs are a little more baked. So come back in May, and we'll talk about OpenCensus in more detail.
And in the meantime, with the same kind of service account that we were talking about, is it possible to, write all these custom metrics, but then still write an API that consumes that information out of Stackdriver and pushes it out manually?
So that's I think what you might do today, right? Is if you really need Stackdriver metric data to live somewhere else, if you just want to use Stackdriver as the plumbing, but then get the data to Prometheus or some other backend, then you're basically writing another extraction step with something like Prometheus as the backend.
Sure, and that just showcases some of the flexibility. Like you said, you can use it as the entire kind of stack. You could use it as just the plumbing. You can kind of do a bunch of different things with it. So you have that flexibility to kind of customize to whatever you think makes the most sense.
Exactly.
Okay.
I think I have a couple more questions. Probably have time for one more.
I think so.
Yeah. Cool. So do we need, coming from Vijay again, do we need some sort of collect daemon, and how does Stackdriver compare with? We can handle kind of how it compares to other solutions offline. Yeah. But really, I think you touched a little bit about how the client is instantiated.
Yeah. So great question. If the Stackdriver monitoring agent is actually based on collect, right? So you can use the monitoring. For the things that Stackdriver monitoring agent does, it's using, collect to collect that information. And it's then like sending it to the Stackdriver monitoring API just for metrics that are already defined in Stackdriver, right? So this API is the same thing that like the agent would be using to send data to Stackdriver. You do not need to use collect or any other agent to use the API as you just saw me do, right? Everything you saw me do was done with no agent. I'm basically writing my own agent, right? I'm writing my own instrumentation that is directly posting to the monitoring API, right? You could obviously use an agent to do that, and then you can configure the agent to do the same thing. And that might actually be an interesting follow-up session, is to kind of basically do a demo of how you might go about extending or configuring the Stackdriver monitoring agent to basically do a lot of this work for you. Because as you saw, I'm literally doing all the work in my own code, right? I'm defining the metrics, I'm defining the time series, I'm defining the sampling, I'm doing the sending, I'm not handling any errors, right? Whereas the agent does a lot of that. It does local caching and all that sort of thing. So there's certainly a lot of value in using the agent. This was just sort of a very quick and easy example of how you could do it by going directly to the API.
Which is another thing that makes it very infrastructure agnostic, right? So easy to just kind of use that API, send it all through, collect all my custom stuff. But there's nothing stopping you from also using the agent on your actual, on the infrastructure layer to kind of collect that data automatically as well.
Yes,
so you can use both.
Exactly correct. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right. Do you have any other questions?
I think we're set.
Okay, awesome.
Really appreciate you taking the time.
No, this was super fun. Thank you for letting me be a presenter for once. It was, and I mean, I don't know, maybe this is too obvious to say. I really think Stackdriver is fantastic. I think there's so many things in it that I think people just don't necessarily know about.
Yeah.
It's fairly wide, it's really widely used. Obviously, like everyone's using logging. Just about everyone's using the basic monitoring capabilities. But there's so much here that I think just kind of goes underrepresented. And so I really want people to know about all the other cool stuff you can do.
So maybe we should schedule a Stackdriver like 301 coming up.
Man. I'm gonna have to study up for 301. Okay. But yeah, let's do it.
We'll see if we can get a little deeper in this.
All right.
Well, thank you all for joining us.
Absolutely.
again, if this is your first time or your 51st time, we hope you appreciate the content. And if you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click that subscribe button.
That's true.
So thank you again, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Folks. Thank
Bye.
you.